Good evening, my name is Todd Young, and I'll be presenting to you today Terrorism and Politics. My research question is, to what extent are terrorists motivated by political objectives? Another way you could cast this research question is, do political objectives strictly motivate acts of terrorism? My initial hypothesis is that terrorists are partially motivated by political objectives. The explanation of this hypothesis, I believe it to hold true because of historical attacks that have transpired from terrorism, either due to a lack in or a sufficient amount of political policy or to meet secular and societal goals. As far as my review of literature goes, I covered 4 scholarly articles, starting with Crenshaw first. I'll cover those key points. Terrorism occurs as violent resistance to the state, as well as a service to the state in some regards. The most basic reason for terrorism is to gain recognition or attention, sort of as an advertisement for their cause. Terrorist violence tends to communicate a political message. Its ends go well beyond an enemy's material resources. And then as far as Schmid was the second article that I covered, basically the key points on it were the acts of terrorism usually, but not exclusively, take place in context of political conflict. Terrorism is an instrument in political strategy. It is never left out. It's always used in some facet or another in political strategy. Without any doing of their own, terrorists obtain political significance even when their motivation isn't strictly political. So even if they go off a secular need, somehow their political significance tends to become political. On to a body. This was one of the empirical articles that I covered. Key points on it is terrorism is a manifestation of political conflict as well. It has intermediate amounts of rights and or civil liberties help promote terrorism. When a country doesn't have a lot of civil liberties or a few rights, the opportunity for terrorism to be present is increased detrimentally. When countries who are authoritarian kind of like transition to democratic types of government, there's a very large increased chance for terrorism as well. Onto the 4th article that I did was by Bruce. He kind of put into recognition or into scope sort of like past events of how terrorism has kind of sprouted. One of these events was that he mentioned in this paper was the Reagan administration supporting the Nicaraguan Contras. And there's also Western support for the African National Congress in South Africa in the mid-1980s, where their actions were considered terrorist, sort of kind of sketchy. Bush 43, President George W. Bush Jr. used a phrase called war on terrorism, which kind of shifts the narrative of terrorists as military enemies, and this kind of calls for military support rather than counter-terrorist measures. So you kind of switch the narrative on it to where it would be fitting to his agenda. As far as my critique of the literature goes, some of the negatives that I found throughout the articles, I kind of wish there was more empirical data to go off of. Only I think in one article I found a lot of empirical data, but even in that, some of it didn't match up to what the author was stating. A thoroughly defined definition of what is considered political would have been a lot better. Some sort of the positives that kind of went through it. Each article said that terrorism is manifested from political conflict. Each article had a healthy historical timeline. They covered all points, and as far as geographical locations, it kind of covered all 7 continents, and also covered all types of government. As far as my conclusion goes, terrorism kind of engulfs itself around the have-nots of society. When there is less opportunity, political leadership, and acceptance of government, terrorism tends to fester. Politics is the vital gateway to terrorism. Even when their motivation is not political, it seems to always kind of worm its way in there. And that's kind of all I got for you. Thank you.